Hello class, welcome to Pre-Algebra Lesson 1-6, which is all about multiplying integers. This video is also going to cover Lesson 1-8, which is about dividing integers. That will come later in the video though, okay? So starting with Lesson 1-6, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to multiply integers. So a couple of general rules for you. If you have a positive and a negative number that you are multiplying together, it doesn't matter if it's positive times negative or negative times positive, can be, the order doesn't matter. It's always going to equal a negative, okay? So if you have one of each, one positive, one negative, when you multiply together, it's going to be negative, okay? This is a really good thing to write down if you do not already have this memorized. And if you don't have it memorized, that's okay. So let's jump into example 1, which is multiplying integers with different signs. So exactly what that last slide was talking about, one positive, one negative. So if we start with this very first problem here, I have 4 times negative 2. Sometimes students are unfamiliar with that symbol. It kind of looks like a decimal that's raised up into the air, but a little bit bigger than a decimal. That's a way of writing multiplication. And the farther that you go into math, the more that you're going to see that symbol instead of what you guys have probably been used to seeing, which is kind of like that X in between. As we move it further and further into math, you're going to move away from using that symbol because it can get a little messy when we introduce letters or the variables later in math, okay? So that's why you're going to start seeing this dot notation for multiplication. So jumping back, I have 4 times negative 2. So I know a positive times a negative, my answer is going to be negative, and then I multiply by like normal. 4 times 2 is 8. And that is all I have to do for that problem. Looking at the second problem listed on this page, I have negative 500 times 3. Again, I have one positive, one negative. I know when I multiply those together, I'm going to end up with a negative. And then 500 times 3 is going to be 1,500 or 1,500. If you're wondering how I did that so quickly without a calculator, a little trick, whenever there's zeros, you can ignore them for a minute and just multiply what's 3 times 5. Well, that's 15, so I wrote down the 15. And then all you have to do is carry those zeros and put them at the end of your answer. So that's how I knew negative 500 times 3 was negative 1,500 without using a calculator. And that trick works for any amount of zeros as long as they're at the end of the number. Okay? All right. Question 1. A race car game takes 6 points from a player each time the player hits a cone. What integer represents the change in total points if the player hits 10 cones? Okay, so go ahead, take a minute, think about this problem. Be careful, like maybe read it again, figure out where's there a positive, where is there a negative, are they both positive numbers, are they both negative? See if you can figure out what makes the most sense for this problem, and then I'll talk you through it. Good luck. All right, for this problem, hopefully you said, okay, 6 points from a player. That means it's a penalty and that is getting taken away from that player. So that would be represented by a negative 6. And then we know that that player hits 10 cones. So I would say negative 6 times 10, that is negative 60 points. Or you could just write negative 60 since it just asks for the integer. But I like to practice labeling my answers, so I'm going to put negative 60 points. Now, another thing for me to point out to you, notice this right here. It's not the multiplication symbol that you're used to there, or the one I talked about on the last page where it was like that big dot. This is kind of like a little star. That's the one that you're going to see me use the most just because it's easiest for me to write without it looking like a letter or a decimal point, okay? So Anytime you see a little star in between two numbers, I'm talking about multiplication. Okay, now using a number line to represent -3 times -10. Notice that this time I have two integers that are both negative. Um, if this picture is confusing for you, it's okay. There's a lot of information right there. I'm going to walk you through it. If at the end of my explanation you are still feeling confused, it's okay. I will tell you exactly what you need to remember. I'm just trying to give you a visual for why, like to help you understand the why a negative times a negative ends up with what it is, okay? So starting with this very first step here, 3 times a -10. So notice they got rid of that first negative just for a moment because this matches more of what we've been practicing, right? 3 times a -10, that's going to be -30. So you can see they represented it with the orange. They did 3 groups of 10 moving in the negative direction of the number line. Okay, but then they put this little negative in front of that. Now remember in yesterday's video, which was lesson 1-4 for us, we talked about how when you have a negative sign, it's really just talking about changing directions. It represents the opposite of what's written. So what would the opposite of a -30 be? It would be a +30. So that's how they took this section here and they flipped it over to this side to represent that the final answer would actually be a +30. Okay, so this diagram shows you that a negative times a negative equals a positive. And that is always going to be true. And something I like to point out to students is that a positive times a positive is also going to equal a positive. Sometimes as students are learning these different rules, they will forget that one. So I just like to say it just in case you were wondering if that changed. The answer is no. So big takeaway from this slide is a negative times a negative is a positive, and that slide just shows you kind of the visual behind how it ends up as a positive. All right, so now we have -12 times a -7. Why don't you take a moment and figure out what that answer would be? Good luck. Okay, hopefully you ended up with a positive 84. You looked at -12 times -7 and you remembered what we just talked about. A negative times a negative is a positive. And then multiplying 12 times 7, that gives us 84. You can see I showed my work off to the side. That's one way that you can demonstrate how you multiply. I do want you to practice some of these problems without a calculator just so you get used to multiplying and, brush the summer dust off your brain and just kind of get back in the rhythm of doing some mental math, okay? So 12 times 7, 84. Negative times negative is positive. So positive 84. And this is the last slide for lesson 1-6. It just reminds you that if the signs are the same, meaning a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative, it's going to equal a positive answer. And then the other side talks about how if you have one of each, so we have a negative times a positive or a positive times a negative, because remember order doesn't matter, you're going to have a negative answer. All right. If you have questions about 1-6, please be sure to reach out for some help. I am happy to help you. But let's move on to lesson 1-8. Lesson 1-8 is all about dividing integers. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to divide your integers. Fun fact about dividing integers, all of the rules are the same. So if we go back to this page that we were just on, you can change it to say a positive divided by a positive, or a negative divided by a negative is going to give you a positive answer. Or you could say a negative divided by a positive, or a positive divided by a negative is going to give you a negative answer. So the rules are exactly the same for multiplication and division, which is why I like to group these two lessons together. Okay, so let's divide negative 160 divided by 4. Well, first of all, I see I have a negative divided by a positive. So since the signs don't match, they're different, I know my answer is going to be negative. And then 160 divided by 4. If you're unsure, you can do some long division. If you don't remember how to do that, I'll show you very quickly. You'd say, you take the second number, put it outside the little house, and then the first number goes inside the house. And I'm ignoring the signs for now. And then I say, can 4 go into 1? No. But can 4 go into 16? Yes. It goes in 4 times. So I'd say 4 times 4 is 16. And I would write that down. So 4 times 4 is 16. I subtract them, and I'd be left with 0. And I bring the next number down, which is 0. And I'd say 4 times what gives me 0? Well, that would be 0. So 4 times 0 is 0. If you subtract, you have 0 left over. So my answer would be 40, and my first step was determining that it's going to be negative. Okay, so that's one way to do it. If you divide in a different way than that, that is just fine, as long as you are consistently ending up at the same numbers that I'm telling you, okay? So why don't you go ahead and take a moment and divide 42 divided by negative 6. Good luck. Okay, for this problem, hopefully you figured out that it's going to be a negative 7. Positive divided by negative is negative, and 42 divided by 6 is 7. So we end up at a negative 7. If you have questions about that, please be sure to reach out for some help. I am happy to help you. Let's move on to our next slide. You'll see we have a lot of the same numbers happening here. So let's talk through each one. Here I have 40 divided by 5. So I have a positive divided by a positive. That tells me my answer is going to be positive. And 40 divided by 5 is 8. Then I have a negative 40 divided by a negative 5. A negative divided by a negative is going to be positive. It's really easy to just say negative because you've already said it twice. But negative divided by negative is going to be positive. And then 40 divided by 5 is still 8. Okay, and then we have 0 divided by 5. Well, 0 divided by anything is just going to be 0. One quick note with that, though, is if you were to flip the order and say 5 divided by 0, that does not exist. You cannot divide by 0. Okay, that's like foundational mathematical law. Okay, cannot divide by 0. Okay, that is a good thing for you just to kind of memorize. It's going to keep coming back time and time again as you move forward in math. And as you get more advanced in math, you're going to learn exactly why not. However, if you have an iPhone, I don't know what the Android equivalent would be, but if you have an iPhone, you can ask Siri to divide something by 0, and Siri will say a little story problem that is sometimes mildly insulting. I think she has a couple of different couple of different examples on why you can't divide by 0, but she can help you understand just a little bit why you can't divide by 0. All right, why don't you go ahead and take a moment, solve both of these problems, okay? Negative 40 divided by negative 5 and a 40 divided by negative 5. Good luck. Okay, for this problem, hopefully you said negative 40 divided by negative 5. That's 8. And then 40 divided by negative 5 would be a negative 8. And here is our last page, the key concept. If you already wrote down the same thing from like the end of 1-6, like how I went back and rewrote a couple of things, you are all good. Or if you have this memorized, fantastic. You don't need to write it down. If you're still learning this, which is just fine, I don't expect you to already know all of this. I really don't. If you are still learning this, please write this down. It's really important. This idea is not going away. Okay, this is going to keep coming back in all math classes that follow after this. Okay, so it's very important that you learn these concepts. Okay, so if you have any questions, please reach out for some help. I'm happy to help you. Otherwise, have a great day.